New York City is one of the most diverse cities in the world, so it only makes sense that its tech industry employs more women and minorities than Silicon Valley does. But that's not saying much. For example, so far in 2015, Facebook has hired just 7 black employees. For Hispanic, black, or people of 2 or more races, staff percentages remain flat at 4% or below. A new study by the Center for an Urban Future shows that 62% of New York's tech sector employees are white and 16% are Asian, compared with 11% who are Hispanic and 9% who are African American.
But things are more complex than just percentages and numbers. And to help us break down this trend and better understand the report's findings, we want to welcome back its author, Mr. Adam Foreman. He's a senior researcher at the Center for an Urban Future. Great to have you back, Mr.
Nice, love being here.
Good. And for the first time, we're joined by Kanye Makubele, who is the partner at Collaborative Fund. They're an investment firm whose stated goal is to be, quote, the leading source of capital and strategic support for creative entrepreneurs who want to change the world. It's a small order there, sir.
Yeah, right.
I hope you got a lot of money to make that happen.
Well, Adam, if you could just start us off, please. Can you give us a sort of overview of the report?
Yeah, we found things, some that aren't surprising. Tech sector is growing really fast in New York, increased by about 71%. Tech companies in New York City. Brooklyn was the fastest growing borough at 81%. Manhattan not too far behind at 79% growth over the last decade. But Manhattan still is the center of the tech sector. About 83% of the jobs in the tech sector are in Manhattan, so Brooklyn, we got to do better. And also what we found, as you alluded to, was there is a diversity issue in New York City. So about 67% of New York City is non-white, but in tech sector, 60% is white. Now, this is a real issue that we need to be thinking about in terms of whether it's education or a lot of other ways to attack this, but something that's important.
Are things more dire for women or for people of color?
I would say both. So same thing, about 60% of tech sector is male.
Yeah.
So in both areas, we see a real disparity. And something that, whether it's, as I said, educationally or look at hiring practices or the city create a tech talent pipeline, there are a lot of things that we could be doing to improve the situation.
Is there a wage gap? Because we always hear about women not making as much money. Has tech done better to sort of close that gap at least?
Mm-hmm. We didn't look at that, but it's very possible.
Okay.
Okay, so Kanye, can you tell us about your work with the Collaborative Fund?
Yes, gladly. Collaborative Fund is a venture fund that's about 5 years old. We invest at the intersection of good and profit, and so we think that values-led investing is actually going to result in the most returns over the long term. We've made over 3 dozen investments now, over half of which are, in this values collaborative economy of some form. And so we're interested in access and empowering young people and empowering individuals to take control of their lives. And so one of the things we've been spending a lot of time thinking about is what does access mean when you think about access for all, not only in terms of the content of each portfolio company we invest in, but the makeup of the founders themselves.
So Kanye, if someone has a great idea and you think it can make you money, but they don't look like the United Nations, are you going to pass them on to the guy down the hall just because they don't have a global sort of outlook in their office?
Shame on me if I do, because it's one of those things where we're trying to make sure that we invest in stuff that can be transformative and that can really move the world forward.
Right.
But there is a lot of unconscious bias that goes into venture capital decisions around entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And I've thought about this and even mused on it many times. And when you see a Latino engineer or somebody who claims that they're a designer but they're not from a major city and so on and so forth, all these things that are baked into these sort of unconscious biases end up playing out in how we make our decisions. And so I'm always trying to bring those to the fore so that I can find ways to combat them.
So is it really like Shark Tank? When people come into the room, they are giving you this pitch and you're just like...
It's not entirely unlike Shark Tank in that it's a very sort of Socratic dialogue, which is an intense back and forth and so forth. And it's a specific type of dialogue and storytelling method, which has a set of habits that may sort of predispose certain people to be more successful at it than others.
Right.
And so there's an aspect of that. But when it comes to the statistics that Adam was mentioning, the biggest piece in my mind that jumps out is the fact that while there's a pipeline problem and while there's all sorts of issues, one of the biggest issues, thinking about it from an entrepreneur's standpoint, is just about access to capital. And access to capital at every point along the way. So access to institutional capital once you've already got your company off the ground, but also access to capital before you get it off the ground so that you can quit your job and even start. You know?
Right.
And so I think that access to capital is by far the biggest sort of disproportionate point in the system, and is the one that keeps, leaves people like us out.
I have to ask you, what do you feel are the social responsibilities of a tech company?
Gosh, of a tech company, that's an interesting question. I think of the tech community, I think there's a responsibility for us to live out the claim that we are in the sort of meritocratic environment, because that's something that tech really loves to talk about, but hasn't done nearly as good enough a job of actually living out. And so I think that's a responsibility. I think there's a responsibility of trying to have the broadest, widest talent pools possible, because that's actually how you result in getting the most talented employees and getting the most diversity.
Speaking of the talent pool, Adam, we've got City Tech, which is a fine institution. We got some folks in that booth who found their way here through City Tech. So what's the disconnect there? We're preparing all these young people, very diverse in terms of gender and nationality, but are they all getting job offers at the end of the graduation stage, or what's that disconnect?
Yeah, I think we're just starting to see a lot of organizations rise up that are addressing this issue, from Girls Who Code to Coalition for Queens to General Assembly, down where he's at in Lower Manhattan. These organizations, and Perscolis is another one that's absolutely fantastic. So there's a bunch of organizations that are thinking about this problem, thinking about this diverse issue, and starting to train people from diverse backgrounds to make sure that they can succeed in these fields. So it's happening, but I think it's going to take a while. I think fortunately, tech sector is very young. We found that 44% of employees are under 35 years old. So there is an opportunity to make changes fairly quickly. It's young people who are getting jobs, young people who are the innovators in a lot of these fields. So if we can make sure that next generation is tech savvy, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your income, then we can really cut into this diversity gap.
How does the New York tech sector, or even in particular the Brooklyn tech sector, differ from its counterpart in Silicon Valley? Like, what's how is it different by nature?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is what industries the tech sector is in New York City. So a really big one is internet publishing. So we have Vice, we have Gawker, we have BuzzFeed, Huffington Post has a headquarters here, Vox. So almost all of that talent is in New York. And I think that's not really surprising. Basically, a lot of the tech sector in New York City is building on existing infrastructure. So we were always a publishing capital, so not surprisingly, we're a tech publishing capital. Then we have Rent the Runway and a lot of other fashion companies, tech companies, not surprising, Etsy, all these companies. So really, in a lot of cases, advertising tech, financial tech, fashion tech, it's because we're building on existing talent, because we need that talent pools of these graduates from Pratt, from other design schools in New York. So in some ways, it's just recreating itself in a more high-tech bent.
So Kanye, how much is this a big deal? Because the iPhone apps come out, everybody's buying them. No one is saying like it's not a do the right thing quandary where there's no brothers on the wall. We're still all buying and consuming these things with not a thought in our heads as to who's really developing them. So is this diversity thing kind of a non-issue?
Gosh, it is a huge deal. And the fact that we are buying them and we're consuming these apps and we're in this content, by we, I mean, people of color and people who are underrepresented in the tech sector, is part of why this is such an urgent issue. Is Blacks and Latinos dramatically over-index in terms of their participation in the tech sector from a consumption standpoint. Women over-index in their participation in many aspects of the tech sector from a consumption standpoint. And so these are the customers. And if these are the customers, then you would think that the people who are responsible for the production and responsible for the sale would look more like their customers, and that would actually result in a better world. And so the fact that they're so over-indexed on the consumption side, I think, puts a higher burden of proof on these tech companies to start to make their populations, from the employee standpoint, look more like the consumers they're serving.
But conversely, could it mean that if these guys are over-indexed and playing so much into the consumption end, and no one is having a revolt or putting down their phones anytime soon, does it mean that it really does not matter who's making these things?
That's a good point. And that's a provocation that I think is interesting. But what I do think is that these companies are leaving a lot of value on the table. And so if you're thinking about these companies from a purely commercial standpoint,
Right.
you can make an argument to them that they're leaving a lot of value on the table because they're not communicating to their greatest set of constituents. And that's where I think there's an opportunity here.
Yeah, I also think it matters in terms of what's being created.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, when they create a new app, they create a new company, it's responding to a problem that they have in their life. They see some friction and they want to create it. I hate waiting for a cab.
Right.
I can't find
Somebody
a hotel.
should make an app for
Someone
this.
should make an app for this.
Yeah.
Well, if it's only white guys who are 30 years old creating those apps, we're going to be solving a lot of white guys who are 30-year-old problems. But there's problems.
those problems?
What are those problems? I guess waiting too long for lunch or something.
Problems.
Whatever it is, seamless. I don't know what it is. But exactly, it's like very bourgeois problems where there's so many other issues across the broad spectrum that need to be addressed. Right now I'm writing a report on how data and analytics can improve social services. Better, more efficiently getting SNAP benefits to people and cash assistance to people in the city, better delivering education, healthcare. And we're not seeing as much excitement in the app community on those issues. And I think a lot of it is because we're not seeing the same diversity of people inventing apps, so we're not seeing diversity of problems being solved.
Gotcha.
So what are the next steps?
The next steps, I think, one was a huge one that was already announced last week, which is universal computer science education in all of our public schools. Mayor de Blasio announced that along with the Robin Hood Foundation last week. I think that's really exciting, and I think that's what needs to be done. This is an education problem. These are high-tech skills, and only those people who have high-end education are the ones who can succeed in it. So we need to make sure that everybody has that really sophisticated education. I also think, in the schools, it's not just about providing computer science classes, but it's also about making this, the school system in general much better. We have hugely segregated schools in New York City. It's a real big problem, the most segregated in the country by some standards. So you can't just put teachers in there. You need to think about the schools in general and how the education is going to be. So, the first step I think was computer science education. The second step is thinking about desegregating our schools so they aren't just segregated by income, by ethnicity, by race.
Well, Kanye, you're like the Viola Davis of the funding out there, the angel. She said where people are separated because they don't have the opportunity. So what do you have cooking that you can share with us that we should be downloading, clicking on? What's the next thing that you're investing in?
There's a couple answers to that. The first one
write 'em down.
is
Little IPOs, please.
mini IPOs,
Yeah.
right? Well, as a venture capitalist, first of all, one of the things that we've done, which I've invited my peers in the venture capital community to do, is to publish our diversity numbers and to publish the numbers of exactly how many female founders we have among our portfolio, exactly how many Black and Latino founders we have, exactly how many Native American founders we have. And our numbers were low. They were better than the averages, but they were still very low.
Right.
Nobody else published theirs. And I think as to why, and I think it's because there hasn't been any pressure. And there hasn't been a sort of push towards doing so. And the reason why I think just publishing it is super important is once you measure something, you start to care about it. And especially when you're publicly held accountable for it.
Right.
And so that's one piece. In terms of the companies, gosh, just here in Brooklyn, we're invested in a company called Makers Row, which is a Black and a Latina founder, and they're doing some wonderful stuff in manufacturing sourcing for companies that are building interesting consumer
America?
hardware in America.
In Brooklyn even? Or is this
In Brooklyn even.
Makers Row.
Makers Row.
You're making Carlo in the hall very happy.
We're really excited about what those guys are doing. There's another one here also in Brooklyn called Drip. And Drip is trying to take this patronage model of supporting artists. And so it's basically just the consumer. It goes directly to the artist, no labels, no studios, none of that infrastructure, so that these artists can make a living on the basis of a direct connection online.
In music or
in
other
music
forms
and
of-
in other forms of creation.
Gotcha. Oh, wow.
And that's also a Latino founder. And that's also in Brooklyn. And we're super excited to be invested in both of those. And there are a number of big name, the Uber founders of the world who are also behind these types of companies. And so from a leadership standpoint, it's coming, and we're coming. And out in California, we invested in a guy named Tristan Walker, who's built a company that is making health and beauty products for Blacks and Latinos, shaving products and hair products, and has raised $30 million, and so it's coming.
Shaving and hair. Give him our number. We'll be testing. We got a lot going on here.
All right.
Thank you both for coming.
Adam,
That's awesome.
thank you so much for joining us. How can people read this report?
Online, nycfuture.com, that's the name of our website. Center for Future is the organization. We're a policy think tank focused on New York City politics. We'd love people to follow us on Twitter or keep up with our reports.
We'll be looking for that next one you're working on now.
For sure.
Those apps. And you can get those numbers too when you start calling around asking
right.
for the roster.
There
Thanks
you
for
go.
being here, guys.
All right, well, Brooklyn's in good hands.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.